The greatest Ukrainian romantic poet Taras Shevchenko was born on March 9th, 1814. I would like to tell you how a romantic poet united the Ukrainians, the British, and the Americans. So, on the 9th of March 2025, the Ukrainians celebrate the 211th anniversary of the birth of the Ukrainian poet Taras Shevchenko. His life story is the story of a man who was able to develop within the realities of his time. Society in the Russian Empire was divided into classes, each of which could only act within a clearly defined framework. Born a serf, Taras defied a standard model of life and became a highly educated and recognized artist. His personality has been described in various ways: national hero, father of the nation, revolutionary democrat. A new image is also being sought. The image of Shevchenko as a national hero was formed in the late 19th century. At that time, the poet was considered one of the leaders of the Ukrainian movement, one of the expressions of popular thought and a reflection of the people. This image was based on a mystical belief in the peasantry as the bearers of, quote unquote, the highest wisdom of life. Shevchenko was therefore perceived as a man of the people, a kind of defender of the people against the nobility. Shevchenko's portraits hung in peasant huts next to icons of saints, decorated with embroidered towers. Even illiterate peasants knew his poems by heart. Taras Shevchenko was perceived somewhat differently by the modernists. What was their way of perception? For them, he was a manifestation of national authority. In the early 20th century, the events connected with the anniversaries of the poet's death and birth had an impact. The ban on their celebration in the Russian Empire mobilized Ukrainians and united various social strata. At that time, the phenomenon of Taras Shevchenko became a factor in the creation of an all-Ukrainian national space, a symbol of Ukraine's unity, father of the nation. Since Taras Shevchenko was one of the most popular figures in Ukrainian society, all the ideologies that have made themselves known in the Ukrainian context, in one way or another, have developed their own model of him. Today, we have 6 such models: Shevchenko communist, nationalist, Christian, atheist, dissident, and anarchist. Of these, the Soviet or communist model is the most widespread. Since 1917, the cult of Taras Shevchenko has served both the authorities of Ukrainian independent state and later the Soviet authorities. For the ideologues of Ukrainian independent state in the early 20th century, Shevchenko was first and foremost a key visionary of independence, the father of statehood and a reflection of wisdom, understanding, and knowledge. He became a father for the Ukrainian people, combining the past, present, and future. The key contexts here were Shevchenko's role in shaping the idea of Ukrainian statehood and his opposition to Russian imperial power. In other words, the figure was seen through the prism of political history and the confrontation between Ukraine and Russia, the province and the center. Revolutionary Democrat. In Soviet times, Taras Shevchenko was considered a democratic revolutionary. The poet's social background and his persecution by the authorities were important for the Soviet reception. This created the image of a figure against the unjust Tsarist regime, who was a fighter against this unjust Soviet regime and a defender of the peasants. Shevchenko's struggle against the Russian Empire. The poet was born when Ukraine lost its statehood. Its lands were divided between two empires, Russian and Austrian. In particular, the governments of these empires abolished Ukrainian legislation and eventually introduced serfdom. Ukrainian politicians at that time acted according to the formula. We are Ukrainians by birth, but we are subjects of the Russian emperor. Shevchenko fought against this idea. For him, the Russian Empire and its rulers were tyrants who had robbed Ukraine of its freedom. He went beyond local patriotism and the mourning of the heroic past, however. His poetry sharply rejected the model of cooperation with the Russian authorities. He gave a vision of the future. If Ukraine had its own state in the past, it should become independent in the future. Taras Shevchenko, therefore, proclaimed the independence of the Ukrainian people so they have the right to have their own state. He was the first to articulate a real vision of Ukraine's future. He established canons that are still relevant today in this Ukrainian society. Which ones? The interests of the community are higher than one's own. The Ukrainian language is capable of producing literature of high quality, and the poet must react sharply to reality. With the restoration of Ukraine's independence in 1991, the poet's life has been read as an example of a path of suffering. Taras Shevchenko is identified with the nation. So, what is Shevchenko to me? Like millions of Ukrainians, I grew up with Shevchenko's poems, loved the sound of them, and breathed them like air. In my office in Kyiv, on a shelf next to the Bible, I have Shevchenko's famous collection of poetry called Kobzar. This is the name of a folk singer. This little volume is particularly precious to me because it contains my late father's pencil notes in the margins. And I treasure the recordings of my sons as schoolboys reciting Shevchenko's verses. I believe that Shevchenko has become close to every Ukrainian, a part of their soul and identity, an umbilical cord that unites past, present, and future generations, each in their own way, keeping a little book of Shevchenko's poems, Kobzar, somewhere close to their hearts. His verses unite those fighting at the front and those in the rear, praying for the defense forces of Ukraine. The poet's voice sounds prophetically compassionate, as if he were blessing the Ukrainian land with a special gift, the grave of his pure heart. It sounds no less appealing to the true Knights of Liberty everywhere on the globe, to those who are now fighting at the front line for the independence of their state, as elsewhere on the globe, as I said, today, as it has for the past 2 centuries. In 2013, 2014, the Euromaidan and Revolution of Dignity, activists of different ethnic origins were ready to die for the independence and European choice of Ukraine, and some of them were then killed by snipers on the streets of Kyiv, the capital city of Ukraine. Among them was the Armenian Ukrainian Euromaidan activist Serhiy Nigoyan. The footage of him reciting a famous fragment from Shevchenko's poem The Caucasus, written in 1845, against the background of barricades in Kyiv, became instantly popular. Exactly 1 month after this video was recorded, Serhiy Nigoyan was shot by a member of the special police unit defending the criminal Yanukovych regime and died soon after that from gunshot wounds. The words that Serhiy Nigoyan recited were as follows: "І вам слава, сині гори, кригою окуті, і вам, лицарі великі, Богом не забуті. Борітеся, поборете, вам Бог помагає. За вас правда, за вас слава і воля святая. And glory be to you, O azure ice-capped mountains, and to you, great knights, not forgotten by the Lord. Fight, you'll win the fight. God is helping you. Behind you stands the truth. Behind you stands the glory and sacred liberty as well." This is a quotation in English translation by Peter Fedinsky from the complete poetry of Taras Shevchenko, the complete Kobzar, published by Blagoslav Publications in 2013. In the Caucasus, Shevchenko glorifies the great-hearted heroes, this is his term, great-hearted heroes of freedom and their sacrificial struggle for human dignity, symbolized by the image of the tortured Prometheus at the beginning of the poem, as well as the virtues associated with personal and communal resistance to slavery. His apostrophe to the fighters for the freedom of their motherland has found its addressees across countries and continents. As I said, the poem was written as early as 1845. This is a romantic masterpiece, which has had a profound impact on Ukrainian literary, cultural, and political life. In a narrow sense, the poem was dedicated to Shevchenko's personal friend, Yakov de Balmen, who was killed in 1845, the same year, during a Russian military mission in the Caucasus. In a broader sense, the poem was dedicated to those freedom-loving people of the Caucasus who had demonstrated an indomitable spirit and moral superiority over the invaders in their long resistance to Russian occupation. And in a broader sense, Shevchenko appealed to all his compatriots. This particular poem of Shevchenko's, The Caucasus, translated by the British poet Vera Rich, she died in 2009, has gone down in the history of the American capital, Washington, D.C., as an inscription on the granite stele decorated with a relief of Prometheus at the Taras Shevchenko Memorial, dedicated to the 150th anniversary of Shevchenko's birth. Vera Rich, a British poet, was one of the few who dared to compete with Shevchenko in the artistic power of verbal expression, and whose translations were marked by a constructive effort both to restore the vocal harmony of Shevchenko's poetry and to remain faithful to its semantic integrity. Her translation is now set in stone. These are 8 lines from the Caucasus that were engraved. Не вмирає душа наша, не вмирає воля, і не ситий не виоре на дні моря поле, не скує душі живої і слова живого, не понесе слави Бога, великого Бога. Our soul shall never perish, freedom knows no dying, and the greedy cannot harvest fields where seas are lying, cannot bind the living spirit, nor the living word, cannot smirch the sacred glory of the Almighty Lord. The bronze statue of Shevchenko, sculpted by a noted Ukrainian-Canadian artist Leo Moore, was placed on its pedestal in the 2200 block of P Street, Northwestern, Washington, District of Columbia, on the 3rd of June, 1964, and the unveiling ceremony took place on the 27th of June, 1964. The memorial is maintained by the U.S. federal government. The site is now known as the Taras Shevchenko Memorial Plaza. Thank you.
Our closing words are by Lauren Brantz. In a time of hate, love is an act of resistance. In a time of fear, faith is an act of resistance. In a time of misinformation, education is an act of resistance. In a time of poor leadership, community is an act of resistance. In a time like this, joy is an act of resistance. Resist, resist. And now if you would stand for the Ukrainian anthem.